Hi, I'm Manny Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS legal hotline lawyer, and today we're going to reach into the legal hotline mailbag. Question: as a seller's agent, how do I ensure the Form 17 seller disclosure statement is accurate so that I protect the seller from future liability for failing to disclose material matters while not crossing the line into directing or advising the seller? This is a frustrating issue for many agents, I know. Common issues are things like, seller says there are no CC&Rs, but the title report says there are CC&Rs. Seller says no common areas, but I know the community has a pool. Seller says they do not have potable water. Seller says they have sewer, but then they answer all the septic questions with something other than NA. So here's the answer to this question. And I'm actually going to give you an answer that goes backwards from where this question is asking. This question asks, how do we protect the seller from making erroneous answers? The more global question, listing brokers, is how do you protect the seller in general under the Seller's Disclosure Act? And let's start with something that you should know. In case you don't, I'm going to remind you that every buyer has the right to terminate a transaction until 3 days following receipt of seller's fully completed seller disclosure statement. Now, many buyers use this as an excuse to try and terminate a transaction prior to closing, claiming that seller failed to fully complete the Form 17. Is that effort by buyer going to be successful? I don't know. It's going to have to be answered on a case-by-case basis. But listing brokers, here's the tool I want you to have. I want you to have a way to prevent your seller from ever finding themselves in the question of whether or not their buyer can terminate the transaction based on seller's failure to provide a completed Form 17. How are you going to do that? I'm going to give you a tool that will hopefully help you protect seller not only from delivering an incomplete Form 17, but also in answer to the question, delivering a Form 17 that has some inaccurate answers. Okay. Listing broker, it all starts with you sitting down at a clean desk with nothing in front of you but the Form 17, the seller's completed and signed Form 17, and a ruler. And you're going to take your ruler and you're going to follow line by line so that you make sure you apply the correct question to the correct set of answers. Now, as background, when you look at the Form 17, every question is followed on the right margin by a set of 4 horizontal boxes. Yes, no, don't know, and NA, not applicable. The first time you go through the form in your review process, in your 3-step review, you're going to compare every question, and right now I don't even care what the question asks. You're going to compare the line that has a question on it with the 4 set of corresponding boxes. And in each set of 4 boxes, there must be exactly 1 box marked. And it can be the NA box, that's fine, but every set of 4 check mark boxes running horizontally across the page must have exactly 1 box marked. You go through the entire form that way. If you come to a question that doesn't have one of its 4 check mark boxes marked, then on a piece of paper, you make note of that question number. I would suggest in column number 1. So create 3 columns on your page. In your first column, make note of the question number of any questions where seller has failed to mark exactly 1 box. If they've marked none, make note of it. If they've marked more than 1, make note of it. Now we're going to go on to step 2 of your review. Step 2 of your review says that you go through the form in exactly the same way. But this time, you're only going to stop on questions that are answered yes. And when you get to a question that the seller has answered yes, you're going to look to the left margin to see if that question has an asterisk in front of it. And if the question that's answered yes also has an asterisk in front of it, then you're going to flip to the back of the page, to the back of the form, either on the blank lines that are provided on the very last page or to a page that the seller might have attached. What's critical is that you are looking for additional explanation and attachment of relevant documents, because the form's instructions say very plainly that any asterisked questions that seller answers yes must include additional explanation and attachment of relevant documents. Now, it's possible that a question is answered yes and there are no relevant documents associated with that question. But so there might be some asterisk questions answered yes where there are no relevant documents attached. That's possible. It is not possible, however, to have an asterisk question answered yes with no additional explanation. Every question with an asterisk in front of it and seller's answer is yes must have some form of additional explanation attached. So you're going to go through your form and you're going to make note of any questions in column 2 that are asterisk questions marked yes, but the seller hasn't provided additional explanation or attached relevant documents when you know that relevant documents exist. Third review. This time you're going to read every question and every corresponding answer. This goes to the heart of the question that was asked. If seller has identified a no answer to the question of are there CC&Rs, and you know there are CC&Rs, you know the seller made an error in completing the Form 17. If seller says there are no common areas, and you know that there is a common area pool, make note of that question in your third column. So now you're going to go through the entire form that way. And all of the examples of questions that were raised in the question itself, where the seller might have given a wrong answer, and any others, make note of those in your third column. Now you're prepared to go back to the seller. The question now is, so how do I present this information to the seller so that the seller can do the right thing in compliance with Washington law so that it is the seller's disclosures set forth on Form 17? Because under no circumstances would you as a listing broker, any real estate broker, ever put your pen to seller's Form 17, seller's disclosure statement. You never make a mark on seller's disclosure statement as a listing broker or any broker. Instead, you go back to your seller. And with this information that you've compiled based on your very competent review of seller's Form 17, you educate your seller. And I would suggest that you start out giving the benefit of the doubt to your seller because it's probably due. All of you are, if you're familiar at all with the Form 17, then you are very familiar with the fact that it is a difficult form. Just from a viewing standpoint, it's a difficult form to read and comprehend because the typeface is small, the lines are crammed together, there's a ton of words crammed together on a series of 5 or 6 pages that the seller has to respond to, statutorily required seller responds to. So it's kind of an overwhelming burden, overwhelming concept for a seller who isn't in the marketplace every day like all of you. So recognizing that, give the seller the benefit of the doubt. Seller, I went through your Form 17 and there are some things that I think either you got confused because the lines run together, and believe me, I get it, it's a tough form to read, or maybe you misunderstood the question. So here's what I learned from looking through your Form 17, seller. First of all, there's 3 questions that you didn't answer at all. Seller might say, well, yeah, those are questions about the septic system, and I already marked that the property's on sewer. I know, seller, it seems silly. Once you've said that the property's on sewer, to then have to provide an answer to the septic questions, but that's what the instructions on the form say, and the instructions come out of Washington law. This is a statutorily created form. Northwest MLS, Washington Realtors, none of us created this form. The legislature created this form and all of the words on it. So seller, you have to mark a box on every single set of 4 check boxes that go across the page. So if the property's on sewer and there's a question asking about septic, then the answer would be NA. Okay. Seller probably thinks that's ridiculous, but nevertheless, hopefully seller pulls out a pen, marks the proper box, and off you go. Now you go on to the second column. Seller, there are 2 or 3 questions here that have asterisks, and you answered the questions yes, but you didn't provide any additional explanation. Well, they're self-evident. Well, they're obvious. I don't know. I have no idea what additional explanation I could give. I answered the question yes, that's the right answer. seller, I get it, but the instructions on the form say really clearly that if you answer an asterisk question yes, you have to provide additional explanation. And in certain cases, you have to attach relevant documents. So for example, seller, you marked the question that says there has been a whole home inspection and you identified when that was, and you identified that you did a whole home inspection 20 years ago when you bought the property. It's still an asterisk question with a yes answer. So seller, that means you have to provide additional inspection and attach relevant documents. Seller, do you have the inspection report anymore? Heavens no, I don't have the inspection report anymore, the seller says to you. Well, then there's probably nothing that would be a relevant document to be attached. You still have to provide additional explanation. So maybe the explanation is as simple as seller had a home inspection performed when seller purchased the property. Seller no longer has a copy of the home inspection report. Maybe that's the additional explanation offered to that question. And then you move on to the third category. Seller, I also want to bring to your attention some questions that I believe you answered incorrectly. And listing brokers, in response to the question that was asked, let me give you a little bit of background first. You absolutely have a duty under the Seller's Disclosure Act to correct sellers' known errors, omissions, and inaccuracies. The law makes it very clear you're liable for sellers' incorrect answers if you had information that put you in a position of knowledge to know that those answers were an error. So based on the Seller Disclosure Act and based on your risk reduction procedures, you are required to advise seller of known errors, omissions, or inaccuracies. So going back to our third column, you're in your conversation with your seller. Seller, I noticed that you marked the box that asked whether or not there are CC&Rs. You marked that box no. And I suspect that you got the boxes confused because this is a really difficult form to read. But you do have CC&Rs recorded against title of the property, right? Maybe seller doesn't even know that they do. And if that's the case, then it might be up to you to educate them based on the title report. But seller, here, the title report shows that there are CC&Rs recorded against title of the property. So I think that answer is wrong, don't you? And you get the seller to correct the answer on the Form 17. Again, you never put pen to seller's Form 17 or seller's disclosure statement. If you have what I would consider to be an extraordinarily rare occasion where you have a seller who says, yeah, no, I know the answer that I gave is not technically correct, but it's the answer I intend to give. The one that I hear sellers struggling the most with is, has a roof leaked in the last 5 years? And a seller wants to say, the leak has been corrected. I'm not going to disclose that it leaked 5 years ago when it hasn't leaked in the last 4 years. But the question asks, has a roof leaked in the last 5 years? And listing broker, you now have knowledge that it did. Maybe seller told you that. Maybe they told you that because they told you they'd made a repair to the leak. But in any event, you have knowledge that it has leaked. You also have knowledge that seller gave the wrong answer. And if you have a seller, and this is going to happen, most listing brokers are never going to experience this. But if you have a seller who flat out refuses to correct the information provided on the Form 17, remember that you have a duty to correct the known errors, omissions, or inaccuracies in seller's disclosure statement. Again, you never put your pen to seller's disclosure statement. So how do you correct that? You communicate to the buyer broker in a provable format. So maybe you send an email to the buyer broker and you get a reply back. Somehow or another, in a provable manner, you communicate to the buyer broker that notwithstanding the representation on seller's disclosure statement, it is your understanding or you have knowledge that seller's roof has leaked in the last 5 years. You can give additional explanation if seller gave you copies of the repair invoices or the receipts for the work that was done, maybe even a warranty from the roofer. You can provide that if you have it. You can suggest to seller that they provide that. You certainly, absolutely let seller know what you're doing, but you don't need seller's permission. You have a statutory obligation to correct known errors, omissions, or inaccuracies in seller's disclosure statement. Sorry, this was a really long video, I know that, but this is a really, really important thing for listing brokers to do to protect their sellers' interest, not only in the transaction, but in post-closing liability lawsuits. If you have questions on this or any other topic, please send an email to me, legalhotline@warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington Realtor member.